Hello, welcome to our kitchen table conversation. I am Barb Collura. I am the president and CEO of Resolve, and I have the pleasure of being your host on this particular kitchen table conversation. And just to remind you why we call these our kitchen table conversation, it's because Resolve was founded in 1974 around the kitchen table of a woman named Barbara Eck. And we lovingly call these our kitchen table conversations because we want them to be inviting and casual, and also just include all of you around our table as we talk about important topics. And I'm really excited about today's conversation. Our kitchen table conversation today is sponsored by Granata Bio. And I have two distinguished guests that I'm really excited to engage with on this particular topic about the need for people of color, the BIPOC community, to participate in clinical trials and research in our field. I'm going to ask both of you, our guests, to introduce themselves, and I'm going to start with Dr. Thomas. If you would introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about why you're here today.
All right. Well, my name is Michael Thomas. I am a fertility provider in Cincinnati. I've been at the University of Cincinnati since 1988. And am currently the chair of the Department of OBGYN here at the University of Cincinnati, and also the current president of the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, where we work very closely with Resolve and come up with guidelines for fertility physicians and providers and embryologists. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks for being here. I know you have a lot going on, and your big annual meeting in the fall of 2023 will be the meeting that you are running. So Good luck to you. And I know it'll be a fantastic meeting. Evan, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name is Evan Sussman. I'm the CEO of Granata Bio. We're a biopharma company focused exclusively on women's health and IVF. Been in the fertility industry now for 15 or so years in differing roles, and really excited for this conversation. And Barb, very impressed with the kitchen background that you have for the conversation.
We've remodeled our kitchen.
I love it.
Everybody's doing a remodel right now, right? Don't we all know people remodeling their homes now that COVID's over and they're sick of staring at? So we have remodeled our kitchen here at Resolve. So
I like it.
So Evan, I'm going to actually start with you, and just you're in the biopharma field. Why do we need clinical trials?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's from a biopharma standpoint. You do clinical trials. You conduct clinical trials to demonstrate the safety and efficacy of those products and their appropriateness for use in patients. And so, really it's a proving ground. Clinical trials are a proving ground for things that are either experimental or expanding labels or demonstrating efficacy in patient groups on whom they haven't been tested in the past. So really, the intent of a clinical trial from our perspective is to take something that we believe to be useful clinically and to really demonstrate that use. And there's kind of all kinds of different types of clinical studies that can be done, but thinking at it from a biopharma standpoint, you're usually looking at something that facilitates an approval. So something that would allow you to be commercially marketed and sold.
Nice. Okay. So Dr. Thomas, people participate in clinical trials. Why do we need a diverse group of people participating in those trials?
Well, I would tell you, I've been in clinical trials and working in clinical trials since I was a fellow in 1988. So over these years, I have helped to bring to market a number of products that are currently on the market, including those related to hormones. I mean, I'm a reproductive endocrinologist, so anything related to a hormone, most of my research and most of my grant funding still is in contraception. So believe it or not, there is a yin and yang between raising hormones to stop production of hormones in the body, which is contraception, and maybe giving hormones enough to cause people to ovulate, which is the fertility side of things. It's important that we see all types of patients, because if we didn't, we would think that this lady who went into a clinical trial, that mimics what will happen to me. And that's not always the case. Unfortunately, most of our clinical trials that have been done primarily in Caucasian women. And because of that, there may be differences that take place on how someone may respond to a different medication. We even see that it's in our contraceptive agents, that contraceptive agents may work in one group better than we work in other groups. We know that women who are over a certain weight, for example, over 200 pounds, we see differences in their ability to stay pregnant, the efficacy of the hormones that we use. And we see some slight differences sometimes in women of color, but we haven't done enough studies, and we haven't been as good as we should be in clinical trials in making sure that before we send a drug out there to market, that we have enough people of all races, whether it be African American women or BIPOC women, or whether they be Hispanic women, or whether they be Asian women. We just can't say this is a blank check that if you take this drug, it's going to happen to you. The benefits are going to be the same for you as it is for everybody else, because it's not the same. Everybody is not the same.
Well, you said something that I didn't realize, and I want to ask you about it. You said that a lot of the work that's been done on some of these clinical trials, the majority, I think you said the majority of the people participating were Caucasian.
Yes.
Why is that?
Because I think the recruitment efforts are primarily not in the African American or Hispanic American or Asian American communities. Most of our recruitment efforts now are social media, but in the old days, it would just be to put up flyers around a university, and the people that responded to those were primarily Caucasian women. And there's probably a big mistrust in the African American, Hispanic American community against experimental procedures that are being done. Tuskegee, everyone knows about Tuskegee. There were African American men who went through these trials and were given syphilis, and they passed that on to their significant others. So there were clinical trials that were done in the United States that did not benefit African American people. We even had some here in Cincinnati. There were some radiation trials that were being done primarily in African Americans without their knowledge. They didn't know they were getting different doses of radiation. So because of that, there is this mistrust of the medical system that has perpetuated itself in the African American community. So you have to do a lot more to get those African American participants, potential subjects, into the clinical trials, because you have to get over the misconceptions that they will hear from their aunts or their friends or anybody else, or the things that they may read on the internet related to doing experiments in African American women. They're not experiments. Obviously what we're trying to do is to bring out things to the market that will benefit everyone. If we don't know what happens in an African American or Hispanic American group, we need to know that they're going to get the same benefits as everybody else.
Yeah, well, you've already brought it up. Let's talk about some of those myths. Evan, what do you see that you have to overcome, and how do you dispel some of those myths in the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, I think, one of the tasks that FDA puts on us when we're doing a pivotal phase 3 study is to enroll a diverse population within that study. Now, they give us no markers or metrics or things like that, but it's a general kind of guidance. And I think one of the uphill battles that we have to fight is that the demographics of patients seeking fertility today trend, as Dr. Thomas indicated, disproportionately Caucasian. And so ways that we can think of overcoming that are to enroll at sites that have a more balanced or more diverse population, to be really mindful of our inclusion and exclusion criteria, so that we're not unnecessarily excluding people of color or other diverse populations. And then, from our perspective, it's something that we have to check in and monitor at some point during the interim of the study to ensure that the population in the study is, necessarily diverse and representative of those patients who are actively seeking fertility treatment. I think aspirationally, we can go one level further, which is to target certain metrics within our enrollment to ensure that the population in our clinical studies is representative not of the population that is seeking fertility treatment, which we know we trends to wealthy and trends to Caucasian, trends to educated, but really it is representative of our general population here in the US.
So Dr. Thomas, here's a question for you. And if you're not comfortable revealing it, that's okay. Have you ever participated in a clinical trial?
Yes, I have. You know what? I was involved in all the initial COVID vaccine trials.
Wow.
And it was very important because I thought that if I were out there, and I'm fairly well known in Cincinnati and some other parts of the world, and I thought if I could say that I was involved before the vaccines came out and I was still walking the earth, that people would feel more comfortable being in the trial. Keep in mind, I didn't know what I was getting, but I, like most people who got the vaccines, you knew that it wasn't saline, and so I was pretty confident I had gotten the real deal. But if I hadn't, at least being able to say these were my symptoms, and if I had gotten the disease, but I was lucky to have gotten the shot, which I found out for sure many months later. But the fact that I did it, and the fact that I felt very I felt it was important for me as an African American male to get involved in the COVID vaccine trials very, very early on. And because of that, it made me be able to speak on the importance of getting involved in trials early on, because I think that, especially since the African American community isn't represented as much, I think it's important for us to be out there. So when patients kind of go back and forth with me about whether or not they should be in one of my trials, I tell them that I participated in a trial and I was involved in it for at least 2 or 3 years after I got my first vaccine shot. And being able to walk the walk and talk the talk becomes very important.
Thank you for sharing that. That was that. I think that's really important for people to hear, and so timely given that it was the COVID vaccine. Really, I know that this is going to come up, and we'll post this certainly as content on our site, which we already do. Remind us how people find out about a clinical trial.
Well, I could tell you at most of our centers, there are a number of ways. There are ClinTrials websites. For example, we have a National Institutes of Health contraceptive trial that I've been involved with since '95, which is on contraceptive agents. We are currently doing trials on different types of contraceptive agents, and we've helped to bring to market things like the Mirena, the Liletta IUDs. We've helped to bring to market a number of fertility-related things outside of the NIH trials, whether it's working with places like Serono or Ferring, which make a lot of the fertility drugs that we use today. We've been involved in those trials. And the way to find out is either, to be honest with you, these days, if you put in, you're writing your sister or cousin on Gmail about, man, I'd really like to get involved with a clinical trial on X, Y, or Z, it'll usually pop up on your Gmail site that'll say, if you want to go to University of Cincinnati for a clinical trial. But in your community, whether you're in Chicago, any of the big cities, especially where there's a university medical center, you can always call them to see what type of trials are being offered. And nowadays with Epic, everyone's generally on Epic as their medical record thing that they have. Usually in your MyChart, you may be directed to different types of clinical trials that you may be of interest in. So there are a number of different ways to find out these days.
Yeah, Google clinical trials, and you're going to get to clinicaltrials.gov, which is the government site, U.S. government site, NIH site that has a listing. Evan, any other ideas or suggestions on how people can find out about clinical trials?
Yeah, certainly plug Resolve. Often will list active clinical studies. MedAnswers is another place where clinical study advertisements can be done. And then, just to dig one level deeper in clinicaltrials.gov, if you do a search for fertility, you can look for things that are actively enrolling. And if you scroll down at the bottom, you'll see the sites that are listed. So, in the example of our sub-Q progesterone phase 3, you can see any of those 18 sites that are actively enrolling across the country. I think the other thing, because we're within the sort of fertility universe, is really to ask your doctor, ask your clinician in that space.
Mm-hmm. I do know too that it, depending on what diagnosis you may have or what conditions you may have, there are organizations, for example, for endometriosis, for PCOS, uterine fibroids, And those organizations also have a really great pulse on the specific research, clinical trials taking place for that particular condition as well. So if you check about any of those organizations, I know that they do a great job of doing that as well. So we have, it sounds like we have a kind of a little bit of a problem here. We need to do clinical trials. We need a diverse population, but we don't necessarily achieve that. And so I'm going to ask this of both of you, what's going on to solve for that between researchers, healthcare institutions, even our government? Do you know of things that we are trying to do just as an ecosystem, maybe within or even outside of fertility, to ensure that we have diverse populations participating in clinical trials? I mean, obviously, we're not the only ones talking about this. We're not the only ones who recognize this as a problem. So what are we trying to do to solve it?
Well, I can tell you, as at ASRM, about 3 years ago, I was put in charge of our diversity, equity, and inclusion task force. And we had to come up with recommendations to ASRM on how we can better get more people into fertility care at lower cost or at no cost. And Resolve has been a great partner with that in helping us get access to care, not only in the current mandated states, but to try to increase the number of mandated states. But in that recommendation, one of the things that we did in this DEI task force, which is now a committee, is to say that our journals, which are basically the journals that produce the data and scientific information for the scientific discoveries within REI and within reproductive endocrinology and infertility, our journals need to better make sure that the investigators are meeting clinical trials requirements for people of color, meaning that if you have an investigator who lives in Chicago and you need to look at the number of people in that area and say that my trial should have X percentage of African-American people before that trial is published. And if that trial doesn't get that number, then they need to write a note on why they weren't able to achieve that. But if they're in Nebraska, where there are not as many, even if they're 10%, 15%, ideally you should have 10 to 15% of people. So we need to do a better job of the investigators to get more people and actively recruit in the beauty shops in places where African Americans sit. And especially even African American men. If you're going to have a study about sperm, let's see what's happening to not just Caucasian men, but all men. So ASRM is being put to the task in order in their journals to make sure that they meet those metrics.
So that's almost that like the end result is you want to get published. This
Right.
is what researchers want to do. And so you're saying, hey, you got to do this. So now they're saying, wow, I gotta make sure that before I even attempt to get published that I've met those criteria. Evan, what do you see happening in the ecosystem to try and solve this?
Yeah, I think from a sponsor perspective, IVF should be a really good place to do studies because you have cost as such a significant barrier to treatment. And the baseline thought should be that a sponsor can offset some measure of cost for the patient in exchange for participating in a clinical study. So clinical trials should be a vehicle for access. So I think it sort of comes down to the economic or convenience incentive. So designing clinical trials that give patients a market level chance of getting pregnant within that study, properly incentivizing both the center and the patient such that you're compensating them for the risk that they're taking, for the extra time that it takes to go into the clinic and do extra blood draws and those types of things. That said, I think if we want to push the boundaries, we need to look at injecting more economic firepower into this sort of ecosystem. So if we want to include PCOS patients in our gonadotropin studies where they're traditionally excluded, we need grant money really to sort of come in and fund those exercises. And I think where we struggle is the perception that fertility is less important than other diseases. And so we don't attract the same level of institutional grant funding that, other more life at risk type diseases get. And so therefore we're left in private industry to sort of fund those studies, and private industry tends to be goal oriented, and therefore seeking the fastest, most efficient path to an approval. And those often don't include metrics for things like diversity. And so I think we've got, in my mind, as I said earlier, I believe that a clinical study should be a vehicle for access. It should be an avenue for patients for whom fertility may be out of reach otherwise. That said, I think if we want to do more clinical research, understanding the limitations and the size of our field and where it's going, we're going to need to sort of have some institutional injection of capital, really aiming at understanding the effects of drugs, therapies, diagnostics on, underrepresented patient groups.
Yeah, I oftentimes forget that I participated in a clinical trial as well. It was one of my IVF cycles, and Evan, you're right. They gave me the medication that I was, the trial was for free. And looking back, I was like, I guess I didn't appreciate that was part of the deal. And I had to keep track of all sorts of symptoms and write, my end of the bargain was, you're going to give us basically your perspective on this particular medication. And they had very specific prompts that I had to answer and, all of that kind of stuff. And then I gave all that paperwork back to the clinic where I was getting my IVF cycle. And I assume it went somewhere, but that's the kind of thing where I was offered that opportunity through my clinic. And so to your point, I thought, oh, I'm going to get free medications for what I thought was not a lot of effort on my part. But understanding the risks and everything else, because this was a new therapy. So and they had people that I could ask questions to. I mean, it wasn't like I was sort of left out of the loop, I felt like I was very involved. So I guess what I just want to make sure that before we close here, that we feel that we've dispelled some of those myths. I want both of you to just share what you would say to somebody who has some concerns. If you, around our kitchen table, somebody was sitting here going, geez, Dr. Thomas has done this, Barb's done this, Evan seems to be like, he really needs us to do this. I'm still a little worried. I'm still a little unsure. I feel like I might be like, am I being like a lab rat? Am I being, tell me why I should do this. So I would love for you both to share that.
I would tell you that I think that people need to understand that there are different aspects of clinical trials, and most people are in phase 3 trials, which is when you already know the safety, you already know the dose, and it's just a matter of seeing if this new drug is the same as something that's already out there. So it's generally you're comparing one thing to the other, and you get randomly assigned to the thing that's out there versus the new thing. And people need to understand the safety issues have been taken care of when it comes to the phase 3. You still need to get more people to make sure you haven't missed anything. But you also need to understand that you are doing something for the future of women. And then particularly if you are an African-American woman, you are doing something to make sure that African-American women are going to be okay with using this medication and being safe with this medication. And even though people have used it and they've already figured out the dose and they know it's safe to use, still, we need to do it in a larger number of people. And that's where most people fit in when it comes to the majority of clinical trials. So the safety should be without question. You're going to be given basically 24-hour access to a provider and their team. And you're generally going to be treated with the utmost of respect and dignity, because they want you to stay in that trial. And they're going to do everything they can, whether it's a stipend, which is there to make sure that, it's not overly compensative, but it's enough to at least make sure that you are taken care of, to go back and forth and having to fill out all the forms you have to fill out. But also, we want to make sure that you understand that as a clinical trial participant, you are helping women in the best way you possibly can, not only for now, but in the future. And particularly if you're a woman of color, you are even doing it more so because you are one of the few that are being involved. And we just need to hopefully have you then bring other people on to participate in these trials, whether it's this one or another one in the future. I think that's why we treat our clinical trial participants in the best way possible so that they always feel comfortable.
Wow, fantastic. Evan.
So I have signed up for the Lyme vaccine study. I have not currently enrolled yet, but I'm very excited for that one. So I like you too. I was just reflecting on my own experience, and it is a significant outlay of time and effort.
Uh-oh.
Whoops. We will.
Go
ahead.
You froze a little bit, so go back to, you were just saying significant amount of time.
Yeah, no, it's a not insignificant amount of time that patients do have to dedicate. I think the one thing when you talked about safety that came up, I kind of wanted to highlight for patients the many layers of protection that happen before the study is ever greenlit, before the study is ever enrolled. I think the most sort of common and obvious would be the institutional review board that has to look at the study design, approve the study design and say that it's a safe, approach to evaluating the therapeutic value of a medication. In addition to that, in the US, the FDA has a number of months to look at study designs as well, and they can have the opportunity to put study halts in place. So before a study is ever announced, before a study is ever enrolled, there have been many people sort of checking that safety and efficacy of that, just the safety of the design of the study. And then often there are interim analyses that happen, partway through the study to ensure that the study is enrolling appropriately and that the therapies are working in ways that aren't harmful to patients. So there's this sort of in the background institutional protection that really should be there for patients and should provide some comfort to patients before they ever decide to enroll in a study. And I think the thing that Dr. Thomas highlighted really well is what the clinical activity is going to be. So you're going to have an investigator within your practice, maybe separate from, or might also be your treating clinician. You're going to have a study coordinator who works relatively full-time on that study. And so there's good, really, infrastructure to support patients throughout their journey in the clinical study, above and beyond what you might get kind of in a normal IVF therapy.
Absolutely. Well, I've learned some things. I've learned a lot, actually, and I feel as if I feel more equipped to talk about this and to dispel some of these myths. I'm going to just see if either of you have anything you want to share to close this out on this topic. And again, thank you both so much for your wisdom and sharing this kitchen table with me on this really important topic. Dr. Thomas?
Yeah, I would say that as far as clinical trials are concerned, it's so important to get involved with them because you can tell people that I was involved in one of the first participants in a certain drug study that in the majority of them are going to be very, very successful. And particularly if you are a woman of color or a man of color, to be involved in how these drugs truly affect those folks so that we know that there's equal and appropriate efficacy and equal and appropriate side effect parameters that affect all people the same. And we can't just say that if 90+% of the people in the trial are Caucasian. And it's very important to get as many people in there so that we know how these drugs affect everyone.
Great, thank you. Evan?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Thomas and Barb for the opportunity. I guess I would give my plug is to say that we need to do more and better and larger and more rigorous research, and it needs to be more inclusive. I think too often we're waiting to see once something gets to market, how it's best used, and that can evolve quite a bit over time. And I think the more prospective randomized studies that we do that are widely inclusive and that set targets for inclusion criteria of patients that are representative of who will eventually be using the product, you know, the more confidence that we're going to breed amongst patients about joining clinical studies and then eventually using those products when they come to market.
Excellent. Well, again, thank you both. I want to thank Granata Bio for being the head of the table sponsor for this. And I just hope that for those that are listening, that you find other resources through Resolve, through ASRM, and through this kitchen table series. Again, Dr. Thomas, Evan Sussman, thank you all so very, very much.